Hi everybody, today I'm working on a 2010 Mini Cooper Clubman base. This is part 2 of a car that misfiring on cylinder 1 after losing coolant and overheating. So I'm removing the cylinder head and trying to figure out whether it just needs a head gasket or something more. Alright, I'm back. I've inspected everything and I'm not finding anything wrong at all. So I'm looking at the head here and I don't see any damaged valves or anything like that. This car did have kind of evidence of a little bit of oil in the water even before this misfire developed and it overheated. So I'm going to guess that there was just a little bit of crack in the cylinder head and or the head gasket was on its way out. The car has about 150,000 miles on it. So I'm going to put a new replacement cylinder head on it and see how it goes. I seriously doubt that there's a crack in the block itself that would cause that to happen. So I just happen to have a good lower mileage spare cylinder head here with only 55,000 miles on it, so we're just going to throw this one in. And I've got brand new head bolts and a head gasket, and I might as well do the timing chain while I'm at it. And of course I'll put a link in the description where you can get all this stuff. So I've already cleaned off the mating surfaces here. I used a scraper and some acetone so it's nice and clean and smooth. And I'll do the same to the cylinder head and we'll start throwing it back together. Get the new head gasket out of here. Plop her down. And we'll tighten the two side bolts as well. Or 3 bolts, I mean. Alright, now we'll tighten all the bolts an additional 90 degrees. Outside bolt gets tightened to 22. And the inside bolt gets tightened to 11, and then an additional 90. And then another additional 90. And then finally all of the inside bolts we do another 90 degrees. Now I'm going to rotate the camshafts to get them ready to lock again. And it's safe to rotate the camshafts now because with the pin in the engine, in the bottom of the engine, all the pistons are lined up in the middle, so there's no chance of them hitting. So we'll go ahead and put the locking tools back in place. Now everything is back in alignment and I can go ahead and put the timing cassette back in. So you just kind of drop this sucker in. I'm going to stick something through here just to keep the chain from dropping. And then we'll put the crankshaft pulley back on, but I got to change the front main seal first. Alright, we got a new front seal. I'm going to put a little oil on this. I'll pry out the old one, being careful not to dent any of the aluminum surfaces. And then push in the new one. And then we'll tap in the rest of the way. Gentle at first with the hammer, because I don't want to bend it. And then I'll finish off with a block of wood. So you can see the inner part moves around on its own, separate from the crank pulley. So we'll slide the crank pulley back over this, and then we'll pull the chain up and then realign everything. Oh, but we got to put these screws in too as well, so I'm going to lower it a little bit. And we got one more bolt on top. Now we can put the sprockets back on, and it doesn't matter, there's no keyways, it doesn't matter what orientation you go, just make sure you put the exhaust sprocket on the exhaust side. And I'm going to tighten them down just until they're snug, but with enough leeway that I can turn it by hand. And we'll lower the engine again a little bit to get the crank pulley back in place. Kind of wiggle and push. And same thing here, I'm going to put the bolt in and just make it snug. Alright, now I'm going to put the tensioner in so all the slack's out of the chain. I'm going to go ahead and make the tensioner completely tight. So now the chain is tight all the way around. I'm going to double check the position of my camshaft blocks here. We know the crank's in time because of the pins installed. I'll reinstall the upper chain guide. And then next I'm going to tighten all of these bolts, and I'm going to start with the intake bolt, move to the exhaust bolt, and then the last bolt I'm going to tighten is the crank bolt. And that way I'll pull all of the slack out of the chain, so any remaining slack is going to be on the back side where the tensioner is. I don't have the best alignment tool. You can see this camshaft looks to be off by just the tiniest amount. So what I might do is actually pull it back slightly and put a feeler gauge behind there to make sure it's totally straight as I tighten things. So I'm going to grab onto the camshaft with my vice grip and then just pull it backward ever so slightly. As we tighten things, the cams have a tendency to roll forward, so we'll keep that in mind as we do it. Yeah, I could probably do about 1 or 2 thousandths worth of thickness here. I'm just going to stick this in there to keep it from moving on me. So the lower bolt should be 38 foot-pounds plus 100 degrees of torque, and the upper 2 bolts should be 15 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees of additional rotation. And this is not in any procedure guides, but I'm going to grab onto the sprocket, and I'm just going to put some counter rotation on it so it doesn't move as I tighten. And there we go. There's the first 14 pounds of force, and then I'll go an additional 90 degrees. And it looks like it's still lined up nicely. We'll do the same thing for the second cam. That seems to have worked nicely. My feeler gauge comes right out. And then we'll go ahead and tighten the crank pulley. And an additional 100 degrees. Alright, the engine's in time, so now we just put everything back together in reverse order. On the exhaust manifold, after sliding it in place, we want to put the bottom bolts in first. Then we can proceed with the upper manifold bolts. And then I'm going to put the roller thingy and the engine mount back on next. So I'll lower the engine to get it in there. Raise it back up to get those upper 2 bolts in place. I'll tighten that 3rd bolt there when I lower the engine again, but first I'm going to put the bracket back on and the alternator loom here. Alright, we'll lower the engine again to put that 3rd bolt in for the roller. Then we'll put the belt back in place, put it over the crank pulley, between the roller and the pulley, over the top of the alternator, and over the bottom of the air conditioner. Remember to pull the cord here, else you won't have a water pump. Push it in so that the weather seal is sealed, and then use the tensioner tool to put tension back on the belt. Now we'll raise the engine up again and put the engine mount back in place. And before I forget, we got to take the pin out before we start the engine, or we'll have a surprise. Okay, now we'll put the engine mount back in, and then we'll put the mount back in place. Lower the engine onto the mount and tighten. And then we'll put the ground strap back in place. Next, we'll put the thermostat back on using the stainless bolts. We'll put the last bolt in on the bottom, and I'm going to put a chunk of paper towel into the socket so it doesn't fall out. The bolt goes between these two heater core hoses. Before I get in too deep, I'm going to put the intake tube back in place, because this rear facing 7mm is kind of hard to get to. And don't forget to plug the Vanos solenoid back in, or you'll get codes. And we'll put all the injectors back in. And I like to put a little bit of silicone spray on them to protect the O-rings. And you gotta kind of wiggle and push so that they go down into the cylinder. The injectors are quite long and they tend to get stuck on the edge. There it goes. It's really hard to see where the bolts go. So here's another fuel rail. You can see they go just to the right side of this little bump here on both of the bolt aligners. So use this little rectangle thing to kind of guide you, because it's hard to see. And make sure that all of the injectors are fully into their little seats before you start tightening anything. And we'll reconnect all this stuff. Give this a nice tug to make sure it's on all the way. Otherwise it might pop off under the fuel pressure. And remember to go back underneath and retighten that 10mm bolt you loosened earlier. We'll reconnect the Valvetronic cam sensor, reconnect the thermostat, reconnect the coolant temperature sensor, reconnect the oil sensor. Next we'll reinstall the vacuum pump. It's pretty snug. You gotta kind of walk it on a little bit at a time. And make sure the seal didn't fall off. And make sure the little lobes go into the end of the cam. Be sure there's no gap between the cylinder head and the back side of the vacuum pump, or you're probably going to have an oil leak. All right, next I'm going to put the heat shield back on and reattach the exhaust at the bottom. And again, a piece of paper is helpful to keep the socket from falling off when you're holding it up there. We'll put the upper heat shield back on. These bolts on the front are easy to cross thread, so be sure to start them by hand. We'll put the O2 sensor back in. I like to kind of twist it, because as you tighten it, it's going to twist, so I twist it the opposite direction when I put it in. Okay, now I think we can put the valve cover back on. And remember, this bolt with the little thread on the top goes in the middle on the front. Don't forget the two in the middle. It's easier to drop them in with a magnet tool, so they go into the hole, and then you can screw them down. I always screw the two middle ones first, and then I work from the middle out. You can plug the breather back in. Put the wires back on the clips. Right, I've put the coil packs in and I've hooked up the wiring. Remember to put back the ground connector for the coils. And I I hope you didn't lose the little 8mm nut. Alright, let's go ahead and put the intake back on. There's a little connector here. You have to kind of rotate it and get it to click in place. We'll put the snorkel back on. Don't forget to connect the MAF sensor. Tighten the hose clamp. Oops, I forgot to put this on. We'll just shove it underneath here. There we go. Saved a few seconds by just jamming my hand in there. Okay, next we'll reconnect the exhaust, but before doing that I need to put the engine mount back in place. Then we'll take that same tool I used earlier. Slide the bolt back in place. Alright, now I got to replace the radiator hose, and the replacement one is a single hose all the way from the bottom of the radiator into the thermostat housing, which is going to make it harder to drain the coolant next time around. So I'm going to see if maybe I can cut it to match up with the existing hose at the place where we can break it to drain the coolant next time. So first I'm just going to make sure that this fits diameter wise. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Alright, here's the old hose with my duct tape repair. So it looks like I need to cut it right about here. Next I'll transfer over the hose clamps and stuff. And I'll spray some silicone on the hose so it slides on more easily. We'll put this back in the clip up on top. I'm going to zip it to the air conditioner line so the hose doesn't fall back down again. Alright, that's all the major work, so now we can put the car back out of front end service mode. We're just going to use a hammer and tap the whole front end back. And when you do this, make sure these little ears here are not getting caught on anything. I'm going to put some water in, and I'm not going to finish putting together the front of the car until I verified that this is a good repair, because there's a chance that the engine block is bad and not the cylinder head. And this system is pretty gross here, so I'm just going to put regular water, not coolant, and then I'll drain it and then add coolant after I flush it to get some of this gunk out of here. I'm going to use a vacuum tool which uses vacuum to suck all the air out so that we can eliminate air bubbles. You just hook it up to your air compressor, and the Venturi effect of this valve here sucks all the air out. There's a link in the description where you can get all of the various Mini Cooper service tools. And it just sucks the water in. It should take about a gallon roughly. Okay, I've cleaned off all the stray tools, and I've made sure that all the electrical connections are up and connected. Well, I don't have the headlights in, but I don't need those right now. I'm going to be resetting the adaptations for the engine because we got a new cylinder head and it's gonna need that. You need special software for that. I'm going to be using a Launch X431V Plus to do this. I'll have a link in the description where you can get this, and I'll be doing a review on this tablet sometime soon. You probably won't be able to do that with a regular scanner. You're going to need something like this, or a Foxwell or a Schwaben tool, or dealer software, or IMPA. Alright, so we got water, we got oil, we've got electrical, everything's connected, so I'll reset the adaptations. Okay, so I connected to the car. I was able to read and look at the data stream and discovered that cylinder 3 had a misfire, which is kind of strange because it was cylinder 1 before. So I changed the coil pack, that made no difference. Then I changed the spark plug and the misfires went away. I also cleared and reset adaptations using this tool. Car's running nice and smooth, so I think this is a successful job. I'm going to go ahead and finish putting it all back together, drain the coolant, drain the oil, and give it a test drive. So let me know if you have any questions about this job. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.